When you search up Zabit Magomedsharipov on YouTube, there is high praise. He's a Shaolin, he's an artist, he's a legend. Kion Kimura gave his career an 8.5 out of 10. No belt, 8.5 out of 10. I beg to differ. Zabit is not a what if, he is a never was. So today we're going to go through the whole of Zabit's career and figure out if he was a special talent with top dog qualities or just a featherweight Michel Pereira. He had a pretty decent run on the regional scene, going 12-1. Originally, he did start his career at lightweight, but when the ACB featherweight title was being introduced, he moved down there. He did have a couple of weight cut issues there, but they didn't really seem to follow him to the UFC. He scooped up the featherweight belt, got a couple of defenses, and then was signed by the UFC in 2017. And I hate to bring it up, but ACB has a history of fixed fights, shady judging, overturning outcomes, and all sorts of corruption, so we have to look at Zabit's time in that promotion and the Russian regional scene in general with a bit of nuance and with a bit of skepticism. But you don't get a championship belt for sucking, so he must have been somewhat good over there. Welcome to the big show. He makes his debut on UFC Fight Night 115 in the Netherlands. Shout out Netherlands. His debut opponent, Mike Santiago, is currently 22-14. When he fought Zabit, he was 21-9, which still isn't too crazy. He had no wins in the UFC, and along with Zabit, he also lost to Mads Bernal and Dan Ige. During his UFC debut, Zabit was held against the fence for large chunks of time, and then he was also extending his fingers towards Mike throughout the whole fight. I counted 2 fence grabs. They weren't too egregious, but should obviously be a little bit frowned upon. This was his debut, so we'll give him a little bit of grace, but taking a guy like Santiago late into the second, when a perennial top 15 guy like Dan Ige is getting him out of there in under a minute, could be perceived as a bad look. Up next, the second fight of Zabit's UFC tenure, Sheymon Moraes. Another guy making his debut. He ended his UFC career at 2-3, but lost to anyone with name value. During the fight, Sheymon had more concrete moments on the feet, mainly round kicks. That was his main weapon, which Mike Santiago also used pretty effectively. And then there was a couple of switch kicks to the body as well. But Zabit really showed off his well-roundedness and his grappling in this fight. He was able to get to crucifix and full mount almost at will. Plenty of rear naked choke attempts, but Moraes eventually rolled into sprawl, and then Zabit latched up an anaconda choke. Kyle Bochniak went 2-5 in the UFC. He really took the fight to Zabit here, despite getting some fingers in his eye. Every time he tried to close the distance, he did have a little bit of trouble, but he did also persist. Zabit grabbed the fence in round 2 and adjusted his positioning in a grappling sequence, way worse than the other fence grabs earlier in his career. He basically pulled himself up on Kyle's body in the middle of like a body triangle. He readjusted, grabbed the fence, and kind of pulled himself up higher. There's a point in the middle of the fight where Joe Rogan says that despite not fighting world-class talent, he's showing that he's a world-class level fighter. And I just have to object to that wholeheartedly. Sure, winning a fight against any other professional is impressive, but we have to put some restrictions on the word world-class. I love Merab, but he wasn't world-class until he beat Jose Aldo and Petr Yan. Tom Aspinall, in my opinion, wasn't quite elite until he beat Alexander Volkov. Anthony Hernandez put a generational beating on Roman Dolidze, but based on his current wins, I struggle a little bit to call him elite. We can't just throw around these words when Zabit is beating 2 people making their debuts and another guy who's 2-2 going into the fight with Zabit. Kyle Bochniak very clearly won the 3rd round. I have no idea what the fuck the judges were doing. Zabit slowed down massively in that round, something that would carry throughout his entire career and something we saw even on the regional scene just a little bit. Hard to track down footage on Zabit, but when we did see him, he would slow down in the latter half of the fight, but the rest of it was phenomenal. Then after beating Kyle, he was rewarded with the number 14 spot in the rankings. How shallow was featherweight? Pretty shallow, but not getting a ranking off of Bochniak shallow. UFC 228 marked the first time that Zabit and Yair Rodriguez would be booked against each other. Yair goes out with an undisclosed injury, typical Yair, and Zabit has to fight Brandon Davis. Brandon Davis was 1-2 in the UFC going into the fight with Zabit, and finished his UFC career 2-7. Pretty simple stuff from Zabit on the feet, but his ground game really shined here. Earlier in the night, Aljo had pulled off the only Suluev stretch in UFC history, so Zabit said, "Hold my beer," and he went out there and got one of his own. Phenomenal sub, set up very well, but the level of comp was not phenomenal. Then he gets a big-ass step up from number 13 to number 6, Jeremy Stephens. I love Jeremy Stephens just as much as the next guy. He has some wins that have aged very well, but also quite a few that haven't. You look through his featherweight run with context, and it looks a bit fraudulent. You know, the shell of Henan Barao. Melendez only won a single fight in the UFC. Elkins, Bermudez, Choi, and Emmett are all good wins, but maybe not wins that should have you circling the top 5. You know, when Jose Aldo is able to dispatch of Jeremy Stephens in the way he did, when, you know, Yair is barely beating Jeremy Stephens and getting massive jumps up the rankings. Jeremy Stephens at this point in time was kind of used as a guy that they put up high in the rankings so other people could beat him and be high up in the rankings even though they didn't really deserve it, and Jeremy didn't really quite deserve it in my opinion. So we get to the fight and uh-oh, Zabit's cheating again. You can't kick while holding the octagon, and one of the low kicks ended up riding up the cup. It conveniently happened when Jeremy was gaining momentum and had Zabit on the back foot going into the last minute of the first. Kind of weird timing there. Another groin kick early round 2. Jeremy Stephens wins the overall exchanges on the feet with bigger shots. Zabit lands a lot of pitter-patter at range before eventually getting the takedown and landing enough ground and pound to win him that round. After the horn sounds for the second, Zabit just stands there, and I don't know if he said something or he just stared Jeremy down, but they end up getting into a little pushing match between rounds here, a technique that Jeremy Stephens would later perfect against Drakkar Klose. The third round stays on the feet the entire time, and it's a very clear Stephens round. 29-28 Stephens is a bit of a stretch, but within reason. Minute for minute, Stephens won more of this fight, but kind of the round-based scoring fucked him over in that regard, but I think you can still maybe argue 2-1 Stephens. I think it's not crazy. And this win over Jeremy Stephens, which launched him into the UFC top 6, is kind of unimpressive, both in the level of comp and the way in which he won. He was supposed to fight Calvin Kattar in mid-October, but Zabit gets injured, so it gets pushed back to November 9th. This fight was the one that kind of inspired this video, and the video is pretty much built around this one. I really wanted to go back because this is the only fight of Zabit's career where people say that he didn't look good. I think the other performances were kind of meh, and there was moments where he didn't look good, but you're not allowed to really talk about that, are you? This is the only one where you can say definitively he didn't look good and not be called a hater. So, the fight starts and Calvin is finding the jab and putting the straight right behind it. Zabit kind of just roams around, either on the outside. He moves forward a little bit while still maintaining kicking range. First round, you kind of have to go with Zabit just because of the volume, but Calvin did land the bigger shots, the shots that ended up knocking Zabit around a little bit. In the second, it's similar, lots of tit-for-tat, tappy leg kicks from Zabit, jabs from Kattar, kind of back and forth, but as the round goes on, Kattar gains a significant amount of momentum and finishes the round very strong with a couple of combos where he's mixing in hooks and uppercuts off of the straight punches. He's finding his range, implementing his game, being effective. I think you can give him that round. Third round starts. 10 seconds into the third, Zabit lands his patented low blow when his opponent's gaining momentum, a real trademark move at this point in his career. And it's more sticking and moving for the first half of the round, and then the last 2 minutes 30 are one-way traffic for Calvin. He's making reads, extending his combos, pushing Zabit back. Last 10-20 seconds he throws a flying knee and gets taken down, but while Zabit is grabbing at Kattar's hips, just trying to survive, Calvin throws probably 50 punches and elbows off of his back. The fight ends up being a unanimous 29-28 for Zabit, number 5 versus number 11, and after this, Zabit would jump up to number 3 in the featherweight rankings. I disagree with the decision, and I disagree with him jumping up to number 4. He gained a position, okay, fair. A guy that low, you gain a position, but then he didn't originally move up 2 positions. He moved up to 4, and then Frankie Edgar, Jose Aldo moved to bantamweight at this time, so then he ends up going to 3, and really weird circumstances, and then he's a number 1 contender, which is weird. So he goes on a brief hiatus until August of 2020, when he's gonna fight Yair again, but Yair injures his ankle. Typical Yair. The UFC supposedly promised him a title shot with a win over Yair Rodriguez, so he felt that he had earned it via forfeit or whatever, and then he wanted to sit out for it, but that never materialized, because in 2021 he gets removed from the rankings, and then a couple months later the reports come out that he has an ailment relating to his immune system or something like that, or diaphragm spasms. He needs surgery, there's a bunch of rumors. We never really get like a fully clear story of exactly what happened, but generally a bunch of things that would impact his cardio. Lots of people have said, hey man, imagine if he didn't have the cardio issues. Yes, I'm imagining. Okay, I thought about it. Now we're back to the real world, where he's losing every third round he ends up in. You can't give somebody credit for something that didn't happen. You can't give Zabit credit for beating Yair. You can't give him credit for, oh, he would have beat this guy. He would have done this if his cardio. You can't do that. Just how I feel, man. Even later in 2021, his coach says, hey man, surgery went well, he's coming back. We don't hear from him again until halfway through 2022. And then he says he's retired. Every once in a while, he will show up like how he did recently here, where he'll tease a comeback that never really materializes. He's a doctor now. Good for him, I guess. So obviously, I have some takeaways. The commentary, not even just the commentary, everybody glazed him to an unreal degree. During the Kattar fight, the commentary team was complaining that Calvin wasn't cutting off the cage, but he didn't really have to. Where Zabit really gets into trouble, especially in his last 3 or 4 UFC fights, is when he's been on his bicycle for 12 minutes. So there were moments where Kattar would purposefully let Zabit off the hook so he would circle and burn more energy. And he was a little bit of a pizzazz merchant. Judges are affected by oohs and ahs. It's just a reality we live in, and no one got more oohs and ahs during this period of time than Zabit. Commentary wasn't immune to it, the general public wasn't immune to it, and I think it was a factor in Zabit's success. In my opinion, he was given some preferential treatment in terms of the matchups that were used to get him to the top. He never really faced a strong wrestler, and he was kind of fast-tracked all the way through the rankings. The combined record of Zabit's UFC opponents after he faced them is 21, 31, and 2. Now, respectfully, I don't really think that Zabit is causing career-changing damage and leaving these guys gun-shy for the rest of their lives. So them being fighters on the decline, or fighters that maybe weren't that great to begin with, is the most likely option in my opinion. 2017, when they signed Zabit, at the time Khabib was big. The UFC was looking for their next Khabib, and they kind of found one that could do some flashy striking, and they ran with it. Right, imagine you get the market that is the Russians and the Muslims and the Dagestanis and such, along with the flashy striking, whoop, look at him go, wheel kick type stuff of McGregor, and you build this crazy ass fighter in a lab and you can push him and this and that, but it never really went anywhere, obviously. He tried a lot of these funky maneuvers, but rarely did it finish a fight or even land. If you look at Zabit edits for long enough, you'll find out that most of it is just him missing the attack but looking cool in the process. You know, Zabit walked so Michel Pereira could run. Total, Zabit had 6 fouls in 6 fights. Most of them also happened at pretty convenient times where there was a definite momentum swing in effect. So that's something that needs to be noted. I think that because of the way the rules are enforced, just like the fan base, high-level fighters understand that they can basically foul without repercussion, and if they want to take it a step further, you can use techniques that are legal but can often turn into something illegal, so it makes it look a little less intentional. Zabit used a ton of inside lead leg kicks from a closed stance, which, when facing a fighter who's constantly moving forward, will usually travel up the thigh and into the cup. Zabit always had his hands open like this, so it's similar to Jon Jones where yes, it's not an eye poke yet, but he's threatening it and it's stopping his opponent from blitzing in and closing the distance, which was paramount in beating Zabit. If I had to say something nice about him, I would preface it by saying that his striking is overrated. But I have come to the conclusion that his grappling was a bit underrated. I think it was the better part of his game. If you take a peek at his record, he only has 6 KO TKOs and none of them are in the UFC against UFC level competition. You know, when he was around, people compared him to Jon Jones a lot, and I do understand the comparison and agree with it, but he also suffers from a lot of the same problems. Not a whole lot of punch power, striking defense that relied very heavily on just being taller, and he did run into issues with guys that were a similar size. So for our final conclusion, I can't be too certain, but I can make a very big inference. Zabit only had 6 fights in the UFC, so the low sample size already hurts him. But then you compile the styles that he faced and the way in which he was winning, and it becomes pretty clear that Zabit wasn't a what if. Even in the 6 fights, we basically saw what his ceiling was. He couldn't fight for more than 13 minutes, maybe less if he didn't get time to recover from fouls he committed. Against Bochniak, Stevens, and Kattar, he had 70% of his takedowns stuffed, and if you look at the top guys around him at this time, I think Zabit loses to just about all of them. You know, lots of people have said he wouldn't have become a champion because of Holloway and Volk. I don't even know if he would have really got that far into the top 5. You know, aside from getting 3 off of Calvin Kattar and people leaving, Jose Aldo isn't getting taken down, and he can push the pace in a 3-rounder for sure. Frankie Edgar is a nightmare matchup for Zabit that never happened. Even though Stevens beat Josh Emmett, I think, a 2018, 2019 version of Josh Emmett evolved enough from the Stevens loss to where he could give Zabit some issues. And then, of course, obviously, Holloway, cardio machine, great takedown defense. Volk was shorter than Zabit, so that might give him issues, but look at how Volk dealt with, the takedowns of Makhachev, who was taller, so it wouldn't be taking him down, it would be all striking, but Volk would fucking cardio mog him over 5 rounds, right? Like, there's a bunch of people there, even someone like a Brian Ortega, who's super durable and could just walk forward, and if there's one thing that we can say about Ortega, his cardio doesn't really fail him. He's durable, right? I feel like that would be kind of a bad matchup for him. Who else was around? Moicano? Meh. Yair. Yair's cardio was okay. You could go 5 rounds with Holloway, so I think you could get that done. There was a ton of matchups for Zabit that just didn't happen. And he ended up becoming a top 5 fighter in the world without any of those matchups. Again, Stevens only won a fight in the UFC and then never won again. Kattar is kind of one-dimensional, and I think 5 rounds he would have very easily beat Zabit. So you take all of this together and you look at it in a real critical way, and you don't buy into the hype and you don't listen to what the experts are saying. And that's why I think that Zabit was a fraud. Let me know what you think about Zabit's legacy in the comment section below. Here's a couple more career breakdowns on your screen right now if you're interested in them. Like, comment, and subscribe for more MMA content. Shout out to Shauna, Proletarian Gothic, Vanny, and Stu for being vampiric enjoyers. Thank you all so much for watching. Zabit bucks are not legal tender. Have a good time.